Gopinath Chigakkagari from Microsoft on Azure Pipelines today on the Azure DevOps Podcast.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Good day, good day. Welcome everyone to the Azure DevOps Podcast. I'm your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and I just realized that for all previous episodes, I hadn't been introducing myself. Oh well, live and learn. Go to www.azuredevops.show for past episodes, and we have quite the lineup. Today, our guest is Gopinath Chigakkagari, and Gopi is a principal group program manager on the Azure Pipelines product. He's the Azure Pipelines GPM at Microsoft, and he's an expert on continuous delivery, and he's been with Microsoft for over 20 years. You can find him on Twitter at Gopinath. It's Gopinach on Twitter. And Gopi, great to have you. Hello, how are you, sir?
I am good. Thank you, Jeffrey. Hello, everybody.
Well, you've been at Microsoft for so long. For those not familiar with you or who haven't heard you speak, you probably had a number of roles. What's your journey been like over those 20 years?
So I have been mostly into the developer-focused products. I worked on .NET. I have worked on .NET Runtime. If you know about J#, I have worked on Java on .NET. If you know Silverlight, I was part of the Silverlight too. I have presented it in many conferences, including TechEd, Build, and Silverlight Mix conferences. So it has been a phenomenal journey in Microsoft, focusing on developer. I was actually a developer before. I started my journey in Microsoft as a developer, and then moved into a program manager role. So currently, I'm a group program manager focusing on the Azure DevOps product, owning the continuous delivery portion of the Azure pipelines.
Yeah, that's quite a long time. That's a lot of products. And was it 1998 when you came over to Microsoft?
Yes, it is in 1998. It's just
that was even
2 years.
That was even before .NET came around.
Yep, we were actually working on .NET at the time. 1999 is when I actually started working on .NET.
Oh yeah. Well, I can imagine how much effort it was to bring that about. Well, we're talking about Azure Pipelines today, and that's your world. That's what you think about day in and day out. But of course, that's a broad product in itself. There's so much capability in Azure Pipelines. Is there a particular part of it that you focus on more than the rest?
Yeah. So as part of the Azure, DevOps, there are 5 big products that are involved. Azure Pipelines. This is all about continuous integration and continuous delivery. Azure Repos. That's for the code. Azure Boards. That's for planning. Azure Artifacts for storing your artifacts, NuGet packages, Azure Test Plans for doing any kind of testing. I am focusing in the Azure Pipelines product, and I actually take care of continuous integration and continuous delivery.
And just for people who might be new to the practices, would you mind giving an overview of continuous integration and continuous delivery and what the difference is and where one stops and where another begins and how they're related?
Yep. Okay. So if we actually see in the modern world, every enterprise or even the startups, every company is adopting DevOps practices. Now, as part of the DevOps, one of the critical part of the DevOps is how do you automate? Now, how much you can automate, as part of your developer lifecycle. If there is a way to automate, the recommendation is try to automate as much as possible. Now, in that automation, one of the piece is called continuous delivery. The continuous delivery is all about how can we just to make sure that the developers are focusing on adding value. That is, I'm just focusing most of the times, building a feature, coding a feature, or doing a bug fix, or designing it, then taking care of how do I automatically merge into my master branch? How do I run unit test? How do I run my functional test? How do I deploy to my staging environment or to production environment? So there is a part of the life cycle as part of the developer. Once my code is ready, if I'm submitting a PR or a pull request, the end-to-end pipeline be automated? So that's exactly is where the continuous integration and continuous delivery starts. And so essentially, as a developer, you focus, you build your feature, you submit it to the cloud system, that is to the Azure pipelines, for it to automatically build, automatically test, automatically deploy to whatever environment that you have. It can be developer environment, it can be test environment, it can be staging environment, or production environment. The entire process is actually what is called as continuous integration and continuous delivery. Now, some people call the entire thing as continuous delivery. Some people call only the building part and running the unit test as the continuous integration, and the rest of the stuff as continuous delivery. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I found that a lot of people in the industry don't quite agree on all the different terms. And so I see a lot of people saying CI/CD as a term, but maybe someday we'll settle on some accepted terms. So with the Connect conference just in the last few weeks, there's been some additional announcements in the GitHub acquisition and that integration. There's been a lot of movement. What are the things that are either hot off the presses or still yet to be released that people should be looking forward to in Azure Pipelines?
Yeah, so Connect was a big event. I think there are the key announcements in Connect included that are useful for the developers. Or one of the stuff is today you can use actually Azure DevOps Suite to do full end-to-end planning to continuous integration and continuous delivery. But as part of the planning, if anybody is using Azure boards, right? I think with the GitHub acquisition, now you can actually use GitHub as your code repo and Azure boards as your planning product, and both actually integrate very well. While submitting your pull request, if you can actually include the Azure planning work items, they actually get linked together. That's one of the big announcements. The second big announcement is we actually just worked on integrating Azure pipelines with ServiceNow. ServiceNow is a IT change management system. Now, as part of the delivery, enterprises would like to use ServiceNow for any change management system. Now, as part of the change management system, you want to make sure that your change request is actually logged in ServiceNow. It's marked as approved before you can actually take the change deployed to production. Now, how do you take care of it? That's the key integration that we have delivered as part of the Connect. And the another big feature that was actually announced there was if you are writing your pipelines today, there are two ways to author the pipelines. One is using the designer way inside the Azure pipelines. The other one is YAML based. You can literally take your pipeline build definition, put it into a YAML file, and check it into the code repo. We actually built a VS Code based extension so that you can get IntelliSense or color coding in VS Code for the YAML. And for the work in progress, one of the biggest things that we are currently working on is even the release aspects also. We are trying to put it into the YAML. And sometime next year, early part of the first half of the year is when we are planning to release even the YAML support for release.
Well, a lot of people are looking forward to that because once you can put your whole pipeline definition in source control, then it opens up a lot of branching capabilities instead of maybe modifying your build on a feature branch and then, of course, the build's broken because it's versioned differently. So that'll be good when that's. By the way, when is that coming?
No, I don't know whether I can just tell the exact date, but I can just tell you definitely sometime.
Hey, it's worth a shot. It's worth a shot to ask. No worries. And you mentioned the GitHub integration with Azure boards. If you were to fast forward, some number of years in the future with the GitHub acquisition, do you think that the default mainline way to store source control might be GitHub?
I think the way I will actually just talk about the GitHub story is today, we have Azure repos. You can actually store your code in Azure repos, or you can actually store your code in GitHub. Both are actually supported. The key differentiator, if you just to see why is GitHub so popular, GitHub is popular for their, one is the open source related initiative. The second one is if you even in your internal enterprise, if you are using GitHub Enterprise or if you are using private repos and then try to do a internal source open source kind of a stuff, that's where GitHub actually resonates well. So one way to think about GitHub is probably a premium offering, whereas Azure repos is your basic offering if you want to use it. So based on your key requirements in your enterprise, you can actually choose to use either Azure repos or GitHub.
Okay, awesome. Well, let's take a quick break for a word from our sponsor.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software engineering firm and Microsoft Gold partner, empowering development teams to be their best. ClearMeasure equips developers with the DevOps tools, methods, and automation necessary to focus on building their applications, rather than wrestling with builds, deployments, or environments. Click clear-measure.com to see whether a DevOps implementation is for you.
And we're back talking with Gopi from Microsoft on Azure Pipelines. You were just talking about GitHub and the key differentiators there, but there's also some optimizations going on with the Azure platform. If your code and software is in Azure DevOps, what's new there?
Yeah, so obviously Azure is our cloud, public cloud. And you can use Azure Pipelines to build any application and deploy to any platform. When I say any platform, it can actually be a Linux platform, it can be a Windows, and if I just go to the cloud, it can be a public cloud, or it can be your own data center. And in the public cloud, we do support AWS, Azure, Google, any of the clouds. In fact, AWS has built an extension and added it to the Azure pipelines because there are customers who are betting on multi-cloud. They actually want to have it as a their application running on Azure and AWS as well. That's one of the key scenarios that we have seen, and then we worked with AWS to have an extension available. Having said that, we can use the Azure pipelines to deploy to any cloud. We are actually optimizing a lot of experience to Azure. Now, if you are deploying to Azure, either web applications or Azure VMs or containers or to AKS, because we understand the backend AAD, so essentially the authentication that gets used for your pipelines and the authentication that gets used for Azure is seamless and exactly same. So, you can just log in and configure your pipeline more easily targeting to Azure. And also once you deploy to Azure, from Azure, every resource in Azure, we actually provide a back traceability saying that, hey, for this particular web app, what code is actually deployed, what repo it came from, and what build it has used, what pipeline link it is available. All the back-to-back links are clearly available so that users can move on between these two portals a lot more easily.
So we know that AWS, I guess, was the first public cloud provider. Now Azure has just recently overtaken AWS as the largest. We've heard reported in the news. And then Google. But IBM is saying that they have a cloud. How many clouds are there? How many are you guys tracking and planning for?
So, that's a good question, Jeffrey. I think one of the stuff we actually, take care is it's super hard for us to, provide target to every platform. So one more capability we have in our product is extensibility. So essentially building or targeting a specific platform we made it easy by having, if your cloud or if your platform can be, interacted with a command line tool or a shell or, any utility, you can actually, or a scripting, tool, you can actually use that scripting or the utility to interact with it, and you can automate your continuous integration, continuous delivery using it. And from our perspective, we actually first class support to Cloud Foundry. And I think IBM also, if I remember, there was some extension, AWS, GCP, Azure, and even SCVMM and VMware also, we have extensions that are supported in the marketplace.
Okay. So the compatibility, there's, if your software is already in a particular cloud platform or data center, it's going to take a lot of effort to move it. And so the compatibility stories is really interesting. But Azure is the Microsoft cloud, and so talk about some of the key optimizations for Azure specifically.
So that's a good question. I think one of the stuff, if you see in all the clouds that are available, I think one of the key differentiators for Azure is the hybrid cloud, right? The nature of hybrid cloud is you can actually have, some part of your data center on your on-prem and some part of the data center in the cloud. It's easy to connect both using, there are technologies available called Express Route, and you can use it to connect both. Now, using Azure Pipelines, you can actually deploy either targeting your on-prem or targeting the public cloud or the private cloud that is available. We do bridge the gap, and we also have, from Azure perspective, a Azure Stack product that is available. Literally, I know in some of the financial domains or even in the health industry, they cannot keep any data in the cloud. They want to keep in their data centers. You can actually use Azure Stack as the replacement there. And we do support targeting even Azure Stack as well.
Okay. Now, for our listeners, and most of them will be targeting Azure or at least Windows operating system, but there's so many different application types that may be out there in the wild, and Azure Pipeline seems to support most of them. Are there any application types that still have some gaps in Azure Pipelines, or are they all supported as at this time, even Xamarin?
Yeah, so we actually support every application type, be it a database application, be it a Windows application, even the client application, or obviously, most of the services, including microservices and containers, are supported. We also have a great story for mobile applications. And then when I say mobile applications, you could have built it based on Xamarin, or you could have built it on your native iOS or Android capabilities. You can actually take the application, test it, and push it automatically even to the marketplace. It can be to the Apple Store marketplace or even to the Android Play Store. We actually have the dedicated tasks that are available for you to test it and then push it to the stores automatically. But with respect to the gaps, I think one of the key gaps we still have, this is what I just keep hearing from some of the customers, which is not the segment that I'm currently targeting, is mainframe-based applications. How do I deploy mainframe-based applications? Is a gap still in our product?
Yeah, mainframe, RPG and COBOL, and there's a lot of those out there and other types. I can see that being an issue, but if they're running on Unix, wouldn't there be a build agent? If there's a Linux build agent, that's pretty close, right?
Yep, I think if they are running on Linux, we do have a Linux agent that is capable of interacting with it, and you can actually build it and deploy.
Yeah, and there's a lot of them that are still on those ISAM files, really large ISAM files for data.
Right.
Yeah, that's a crazy world, and the people who are experts in that, they want to retire.
I know.
They actually don't want to work on it anymore.
I know. I just keep getting this.
Did you do any COBOL programming way back when?
No, only during the college time.
Yeah. I did one class of COBOL, and then I tutored a few classmates in COBOL as well who couldn't get it. But that's, and then I've worked with a few clients who had existing COBOL, and that class really helped out. But I've never built one from scratch. Just kind of help with some client work. So, but there's a lot of it out there.
Yeah. So Jeffrey, you actually asked about Azure's stuff. I think I have a few more Azure specific things that we have. Do you want me to cover that?
Yeah, let's do it.
Right. Okay. So if you look at Azure perspective, the offerings that they have are Azure Web Apps. Azure Web Apps are, primarily, if you have any web application, and it can be a Node.js, Java, PHP, Python, .NET, any of those applications. How do you run it? We actually have that experience. In fact, if you are a .NET based customer who are running in Visual Studio, you can actually, today most of the people right click and then deploy. Instead of right click and deploy, we actually have a CI/CD configuration available directly inside the project, where you can just right click and then say, hey, here is my repo, here is the Azure Pipelines account. We take care of configuring it. And once you configure it from Visual Studio, you don't need to continuously deploy. You actually commit your code. We actually take care of deploying it. That's the support that is today supported for Azure Web Apps. And the next biggest key differentiator and key optimize we have is for containers. If you are targeting, again, web app for container, service fabric, or even Azure Kubernetes Service, we call it as AKS. Now, if you are deploying your container applications to any of these targets, we again have a dedicated task with respect to, if you have AKS, then we have Helm charts that are available. We have Kubernetes, if you have spec files, we can take those spec files and then deploy automatically. We can just build your Docker builds in the cloud and run the unit test using Docker test, and the generated Docker images, we can just push them to any of these, be it web app for container or AKS. The third one is the VMs. Now, as part of the VMs, and the VM can be your Windows VM or a Linux VM, we have something called deployment groups. Deployment groups is nothing but you just install an agent on these VMs, and it doesn't matter whether you configured any firewalls or any networking hardening that you have done. It can just talk to the Azure pipelines or any of the NuGet package servers to download the packages and deploy and orchestrate. Again, it works for Windows or Linux, any of those platforms. Finally, we have a great story for even the databases too, because every application will have some kind of a database that is available. So we have optimizations built for SQL DB. I think we have some story available even for MySQL and Cosmos DB. We're actually working on making the Cosmos DB story a little bit more better with the default templates that are available.
Well, I'm glad you brought up two things. One is containers, because there's huge growth in at least people adopting and people talking about containers. And of course, our audience has lots of .NET software. And so what parts are ready to move to containers right now and have good support in Azure Pipelines and in Azure, so that the listeners could take their existing .NET framework applications, and they're just not going to rewrite it to .NET Core soon, but they have this existing software. So what parts can they jump on right now with containers?
Yeah. So if you are brand new, if you are building on .NET Core, then the choices that you have are a lot more. Like you can just take the .NET Core one and then run it in the web app for container, or you can run it in AKS, and you can run it in Service Fabric too. That's the story. But I completely agree. If you already have an existing .NET framework applications, I think for that, I think our story is Service Fabric, right? Service Fabric is where it's easier for you to lift your existing Windows based application and run it inside the Service Fabric. So we have a built-in deployment integration available from Azure Pipelines to take any application deployed to Service Fabric. So that's the story that I recommend for customers, using Windows-based applications.
Okay. And you also mentioned database, which you're right. Every application has a database, and most of the .NET applications are going to be using SQL Server. And that's been an area that doesn't seem to have settled down over the last few years as far as just the changing of the options, and Visual Studio bundled Redgate Ready Roll, which is now change automation, and then DACPack was there, for a while. Has that settled down where there is a firm recommended way to do automated database schema migrations at this point, or are there still multiple options being designed?
That's a good question, Jeffrey. In fact, customers tell me how do I do the database DevOps? And there are advanced people who are trying to take database DevOps to a new level. But there are people who still, try to, modify the databases completely manually. They are still not getting into the database automation. So, it's hard. From our perspective, we still have both the strategies. Like, if customers want to use the DACPacks to do the deployment, we have a story that is available. And again, Redgate actually has built a first-class extension to Azure Pipelines, so that you want to take your databases and then figure out what exactly is the delta that has happened, and apply the delta onto the SQL servers. And then they do even support the Oracle as well, if you are using Oracle in the back end. I think our current story, in fact, the internal story, we have a phenomenal story. For example, the entire Azure DevOps product itself gets deployed using Azure Pipelines. And when we do the deployment, we use in the backend the Azure SQL Pass, right? We significantly use the Azure SQL Pass solution for the cloud-based Azure DevOps. Now, in that, we use the Azure Pipelines to automatically, we call it as online deployment, where the database is online. When the database is online, without taking it down, we actually, deploy or upgrade the schema, update the data management, and then reconnect it back. And that's the solution that we are actually trying to see, how we can bring it back to everybody.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But it's a hard problem. It's a very hard problem.
Gotcha. So still more to come in that space.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, there's a lot we talked about today. Before we go, is there anything you would point our listeners to that they should follow up on for more information?
Yeah, so you can go to the Azure Pipelines web page, and we have a bunch of documentation that is available. There are a couple more key points that I would like to talk about Azure Pipelines. We call it as a differentiators, right? I think in the modern world, everybody who is practicing the DevOps, they are giving autonomy or freedom to their developers or their teams to choose whichever code repo that they want. There are customers who are on GitHub. There are customers who are on GitLab. There are customers who are on Azure repos, because that's the freedom that they want to give. Similarly, they want to give the same freedom for, I want to use work items or Azure boards as my planning system, or some people use Jira for their planning system. And same for CI/CD, customers can use Jenkins, customers can use Azure Pipelines for doing it fully, or customers can even use some of the deployment systems like Chef, Puppet, or Ansible too. So now with this choice that is available, how do I get a traceability, or how do I just make sure that my deployments are compliant, right? So that's one of the key problems that I hear from enterprises. What we have done in Azure Pipelines, you can actually just use the entire thing with Azure Pipelines, Azure Repos, Azure Boards, or instead of Azure Repos, you can use GitHub too, because GitHub is Microsoft. We have provided a nice integration between these products. But in addition to this, today, Azure Pipelines actually works with Jira, Jenkins, GitHub, or GitLab very well. So you can be using GitHub as your source control system. You can be using Jira as your planning system. You can be using Jenkins for your build system, you can still use Azure Pipelines to deploy to Azure, or for that matter, any target that you have. You still get the exact traceability of tell me what I'm deploying in this current deployment. What code commits are coming in, what new features or bug fixes that are coming in. We give the customers the clear end-to-end traceability to it. That's a significant differentiator in the product.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Gopi, for visiting with me. It was a good time and lots of great information for the listeners. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
And until next week, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.